Hello students, welcome back to our Bridge Course online classes. In the previous video, we have discussed the physical quantities and their types in detail. We have discussed the definition of scalars and vectors. In this video, we are going to discuss the types of vectors in detail. So let us start the video. The topics to be covered in this video are the definition of vector, types of vectors. What is a vector? Already we have discussed a vector is a physical quantity which can be measured and expressed. A quantity having both magnitude and direction. Hence, a vector possesses both magnitude as well as direction. The example for vector quantity are displacement, force, torque, momentum, etc. Now let us discuss the types of vectors. Totally there are 10 types of vectors. Those are zero vector, unit vector, position vector, co-initial vector, like and unlike vectors, coplanar vectors, collinear vectors, equal vectors, displacement vectors, and lastly, negative of a vector. Now let us discuss all these vectors one by one. The first vector is a zero vector. What is a zero vector? A zero vector is a vector when the magnitude of the vector is 0 and the starting point of the vector coincides with the terminal point. In other words, the vector AB, the coordinates of point A and the same as that of the point B. Then the vector is said to be a zero vector and it is denoted by 0 with the arrow mark above the 0. This follows the magnitude of the zero vector is a 0 and the direction of such a vector is indeterminate. What does it mean? In the first image, you can see a vector A. Here, the vector is starting from a point O and ends at the point A. The point O is called as the starting point and A point end point is called as the terminal point. In the zero vector, the starting point and the terminal point both are coinciding with each other. The arrow here indicates the magnitude of the vector. As long as the arrow is there, the as large becomes the magnitude of the vector. Which means that in the zero vector, there is no arrow, there is no magnitude. Hence, the zero vector is having a zero magnitude. It does not possess any kind of magnitude. And the zero vector does not have any particular direction. And the direction of such vector cannot be determined. Such vector is known as zero vector. Hence, a zero vector means a vector quantity which is having zero magnitude and no particular direction. This is the definition of zero vector. Now let us move to the next vector, that is unit vector. What is a unit vector? A vector having unit magnitude. The name itself specifies the definition of the vector. Unit means 1. A vector having magnitude of 1 unit length is called as unit vector. Suppose if x is a vector having a magnitude x, then the unit vector is denoted by x and a cap above the symbol x in the direction of the vector x, and it has the magnitude equals to 1. So which means that the unit vector is having a magnitude of 1 and the symbol given for unit vector is the symbol of the vector and cap above the symbol. So the unit vector is given by x cap is equals to x into the magnitude of the vector. If you are reading a unit vector, you must read it as x cap. Say for example, there is another vector called as I. Then we read it as I cap, j cap, k cap, etc. So you can observe the image. In this picture, there are three axes. Those are x-axis, y-axis and z-axis. Along the x-axis, the unit vector is called as I cap. Along y-axis, the unit vector is known as j cap. Along z-axis, the unit vector is known as k cap. It must be carefully noted that any two unit vectors must not be considered as equal because they might have the same magnitude, but the direction in which the vectors are taken might be different. Hence, one unit vector is never equals to the another unit vector only because of its direction. So students, a unit vector is nothing but a vector which is having a magnitude of unit length and it is symbolized as x cap if x is the unit vector. So this is the definition of unit vector. Now let us move to the next vector, that is position vector. What is position vector? If O is taken as origin and P is an arbitrary point in space, then the vector OP is called as position vector of the point P. Here you can observe the diagram. In the diagram, there is a coordinate system and there is a point P on this coordinate system which is having the coordinates x, y and z. It is located from origin at the distance x, y and z. The position of the P vector is specified by these coordinates x, y, z. This vector OP is called as position vector of the point P. Say for example, there is another point Q with respect to the origin. Then the vector OQ is also known as position vector of the point Q. The position vector simply denotes the position or location of a point in the three-dimensional Cartesian system with respect to the reference origin. Simply, we can call it as a position vector which locates the position of a point in three-dimensional space. So this is the definition of position vector. Now let us move to the co-initial vectors. What are co-initial vectors? Co-initial means, co means similar, initial means starting point. The vectors which are having same starting point are called as co-initial vectors. Already we have discussed the vector is having 2 points. Those are starting point and terminal point. If the vectors are having same starting points, then those vectors are known as co-initial vectors. In the picture, you can observe that there are 3 vectors from the same starting point O. Those are vector OA, vector OB and vector OC. These 3 vectors are having same starting point O. Hence, these 3 vectors are known as co-initial vectors. Therefore, the vectors having same starting point are called co-initial vectors. Next vector are like and unlike vectors. The vectors having same direction are known as like vectors. On the contrary, the vectors having opposite direction with respect to each other are known as unlike vectors. In the first image, you can see the 2 arrows in the same direction, which means that the 2 vectors are in the same direction. Hence, the 2 vectors having same direction are called like vectors. In the second image, you can see the vectors having different direction or opposite direction. So, these vectors are known as unlike vectors. Next type of vectors are coplanar vectors. What are coplanar? Co means similar, planar means same plane, which means that 3 or more vectors lying in the same plane. If there is a plane and I am placing 3 or more vectors on that plane, so those vectors are called as coplanar because they are lying in the same plane. Such vectors are known as coplanar, which are existing in the same plane. The next type of vectors are equal vectors. 2 or more vectors are said to be equal only when their magnitude is equal and also their direction is same. You can observe in the image there are 2 vectors, A vector and B vector. The length of the arrow of vector A is same as that of the length of the arrow of vector B, which means that the vector A is having equal magnitude as that of vector B. Also, the direction of vector A is pointing similar to the direction of the vector B. Hence, both are having the same direction. Also, the magnitude of these vectors are unequal. Those vectors are called as equal vectors. So, equal vectors means not only their magnitude are equal, but their magnitude and direction are also same. Next category is collinear vectors. What are collinear vectors? The vectors which lie along the same line or parallel lines are known as collinear vectors. They are also known as parallel vectors. For example, there are two houses parallel to each other. Then we call them as collinear houses. Similarly, if there are two vectors parallel to each other, then we call them as collinear vectors. Collinear means which are existing parallel to each other. Such vectors are known as collinear vectors. As you can observe in the image, there are two vectors parallelly in the same direction, and also there is another vector in the opposite direction. But all the three vectors are parallel to each other, hence we call the three vectors as collinear. The direction does not matter, but whether they are parallel to each other or not is specified by collinear vectors. Now, the next type of vector is negative of a vector. What is negative of a vector? If two vectors are same in magnitude but exactly opposite in direction, then both the vectors are called as negative of each other. For example, assume there are two vectors PQ and QP such that these vectors are exactly same in magnitude but opposite in direction. Then these vectors are given by PQ is equals to negative of QP. So this negative of QP is called as negative of a vector PQ. You can observe in the image there is a vector PQ and another vector which is exactly opposite in the direction of PQ, that is QP. So you can write it as PQ vector equals to negative of QP vector. So this negative vector is known as negative of a vector QP. The last category of the vector is displacement vector. If a point is displaced from position O, O means origin. If the point O S is displaced from origin to S, if a point is displaced from position O to S, then the displacement OS represents a vector OS, which is known as displacement vector. So anything which displaces in the three-dimensional space is known as displacement vector. So these are the 10 categories in the vector classification. So those are zero vector, unit vector, position vector, co-initial vector, like and unlike vectors, coplanar vectors, collinear vectors, equal vectors, displacement vector, and lastly negative of a vector. If the magnitude of a vector becomes 0, then we call it as zero vector. If the magnitude of a vector is equals to 1, is equals to unity, then we call it as unit vector. If the vector represents the position or location of a point, then we call it as position vector. If two or more vectors are having same initial point, then we call them as co-initial vectors. If two vectors are having same direction, then having equal magnitude, then they are like vectors, but they are having different directions, then they are called unlike vectors. If the vectors are in the same plane, then they are known as coplanar vector. If two or more vectors are parallel to each other, then we call them as collinear vectors. If the two vectors are having same magnitude as well as direction, then we call them as equal vectors. If a point displaces from origin to some other point, then that displacement is known as displacement vector. And lastly, a vector having equal and opposite to one specific vector, then we call it as a negative of the previous vector. So these are the different types of vectors. In the next video, I will discuss some more interesting topics on the bridge course in the physics topic. Thank you.